Welcome back. In this part we are going to visualize the source and target units that we get after fragmentation by sentences, paragraphs or words, depending on what we chose in window data sources using the combo box here. We can choose paragraphs, sentences or words. So previously we have created this window, but we have not really designed anything. Well, first of all, let's go to the constructor. As you remember, we created a wrapper that will close the colon window and then show this window align fragments. But still it needs to accept arguments, and actually the constructor has to accept all the same arguments as well. I will create a region here called constructor. This constructor will accept these two arguments, and we can make a summary now. So constructor that can be called either directly or using the, and we will reference our window align fragments manager wrapper. As I have previously said, if you don't want to close the previous window, you can just call this constructor. But because I do need to close the colon window, I will use this wrapper that will call this constructor too after it closes the colon window. So it has two parameters, source fragments. Actually, I can copy them from here and target fragments from here. Now we need to finish our wrapper because, as you see, I left a to do here. We will utilize the using construct to ensure that the resources are freed when the window is closed. Well, in general, if you know that any class object can be disposed, use the using construct. So type using and in braces create a variable window equals new window align fragments. I now call this constructor and I pass all the same arguments, so source fragments and target fragments. Right now I just create a new window, then I need to close the color, window to close dot close, and then I need to show this window. Just the show dialog method. It shows you an exception because we need to inherit our window from the interface called iDisposable. So iDisposable, then you need to press Ctrl dot, and I usually select implement all members explicitly. And now you see this new method. Let's put it up. Right now, if you close this window, it will call this method and it will call this line which will raise an exception. Right now I don't have any specific behavior in mind, so I will just leave it empty. But in future, of course, you need to define your own logic, how it should be closed properly to free all the used resources. Now let's create new private members, because we will need to store these variables somewhere, not just in the arguments of a specific method. So region private members. I will create a new private read-only string array called mSource fragments. Read-only means that it can be assigned only in the constructor, but not in other methods. So source fragments, well, actually, let's copy this. Obtained from the source text. And of course, the same for target fragments. And copy this description as well. And now we will assign them in our constructor. So after initialize component, mSource fragments equals source fragments. So we assign our private field using this argument, and we do the same for mTargetFragments equals targetFragments. Now we have successfully passed our data, but we still do not display it anywhere. And to do it, we need to go to our designer. First of all, let's change the title to alignment and the name of the program. Let's also add the loaded event, because I decided that we will use two list views. They will be filled with source and target arrays. Well, basically our fields. So window loaded, but before we navigate to it, let's also extend our markup. So we will create first two column definitions. So grid column definitions, and here column definition. They will be equal, as you see, and create list view. It will be in grid column 0. Absolutely necessary, give it a name. Well, if you use binding, it's not necessary, but in this part I'm not going to use it. List view 1, and the same for list view 2, which will be in grid column 1, list view 2. Now let's navigate to window loaded event, and here first let's set the data context to this window, which means that if we define properties in this file, we will be able to bound to them from here. So then we will set the item source of our list views to our private fields, mSourceFragments and mTargetFragments. List view 1, and then item source, not items, but item source, equals mSourceFragments. And the same for list view 2. But it will be equal to mTargetFragments. Now we can check if they are correctly displayed. Let's input here some test data. Well, first let's use paragraphs, align to text, and yeah, now you see the string arrays are correctly displayed here. And if we choose to fragment them using sentences, so here sentence 2 and sentence, align to text, and here you see it has fragmented them by sentences now. And of course, if you choose words, you will have many more items in both list views. I'd like to change some properties of this window. Mainly, I want it to be much larger, so like 1366. I think we can even remove the height. It will be set to auto. Then I also want to change the default start application to center screen. And also I will set the min height, for example 400, min width to, let's say, 725. And by default the window state will be set to maximized. Also, I plan to use not just list views, but more specifically the grid view in each of them. And we will need to align the width of their columns. In order to do that, we will need to add the content rendered. Event, press F12. The difference between this and this happens after the constructor, but this happens after all visual elements are done loading. In this part we will leave it empty, because it's an issue of another kind, which is not directly related to this part. And after the properties, we will also need to define window resources. Window.resources. And in order to see the icon buttons, and we will have a lot of them, when they are disabled, because by default they are always set to 100% opacity, we will decrease their opacity to say 25% when they are disabled. So we will need to create a new style for images. It's triggers, style triggers, and define a new trigger for the property called isEnabled. So when it is set to false, we will set the property called opacity to the value 0.25, and that's it. Also, when we will start using the grid view, by default the grid column headers are centered, and because our fragments can be of any length, and it means that the width of each item can be as long as it needs to be, it would be better to align the column headers to the left side. So let's do it right away. Style target type, and here open curly braces, type X type, and grid view column header. We don't need to use triggers. Instead, we just need one setter for the property called horizontal content alignment, and the value will be set to left. In future, we will use special class objects instead of usual strings as items. And because the length of the text fragment can be very large, we will add a tooltip. It will appear when we hover over our mouse, and it will contain the text of the whole unit, which means that we don't necessarily will have to scroll to the right to see the whole fragment. So let's do it right away. Although it is a resource as well, it's not a style. It will be a control. Tooltip. It will have its own key, and I will name it unit tooltip, and its foreground will be set to black. It will have a khaki background, and let's set has drop shadow to false and set its opacity to 1. This tooltip will contain just one text block. Its text will be bound to a property. Well, it does not exist now, but I will name it later the same text. But we do need to set its max width, because in theory our paragraph can be larger than your screen, and we will need to limit anyway. Let's set max width to, for example, 450. Absolutely necessary, set text wrapping to wrap. And for each object of the special class, this tooltip will display exactly its text property. At the top of this window, we will have a tool panel, which will be common for both list views. Well, and maybe a few for each of them separately. So, let's leave a comment here. So it's an outer grid. Inside this outer grid, we will create row definitions. So grid row definitions, and here define a new row definition. Well, actually two of them, but the first one will have a specific height of, for example, 25. And this structure will be placed in row 1. So let's create a new grid. Grid row 1, and put these controls and column definitions here, like this. Now, for the top row, we will create a grid as well, and it will be our top panel, and this will be our grid for list views and bottom tools. At the bottom, we will also have tools which are dedicated only to specific list views. So here, grid row 0, and let's add a margin, well, just a tiny margin of 1. And this panel will consist of 3 columns: for the source list view, for both list views, and for the target list view. So let's create column definitions, grid column definitions, and here column definition, column definition, column definition. The width will be set to auto. Alright. Well, I think we will not go further with this top panel in this part, because it already goes out of the scope of this part, but let's see how it looks now. So some test data, and here also let's check words. So word, and this should be split into 2. Yeah, it is. And as you see, we now have some white space here, which will be given to top panel. So we will have a notification button here, the word source here, the word target here, and a panel for tools, which will be common to both list views. Now let's return to our window data sources here, and let's navigate to its constructor. Actually, not its constructor, but the loaded event. Its loaded event is here. Let's move it up under the constructor, and we will check here if the program is registered, because if it is, we will hide this register button. If the program is registered, if qp._ is licensed, we will hide the register button. So button underscore register dot visibility equals visibility dot collapsed. Now let's also add the code to its button click event. So press F12, and I think we should move this button register click under the loaded event here. Before we write the code for it, let's navigate to our private members and create a new private constant variable. Well, actually a field, private const double m dark opacity. And it will be used when we open the window by to darken this window. Let's set it to 0.5. If you want to make the background darker, you can use a lower value. If you want to make it lighter, use a bigger value like 0.8 or something like that. So its summary will be this window's opacity when another window is opened to make fading effect. Now let's return to our button register click, and here we will first darken this window. So opacity equals m dark opacity. Then we will initialize window by. So initialize window by, and here window by, let's call it win, equals new window underscore by, and we will set the owner to this window, and we will not show it in taskbar. So let's set it to false, and then we need to show it. So show window by, so window dot show dialog, and after this window is closed, we need to remove darkness from this window. So we just need to set the opacity back to 1. And we also need to show this window in taskbar, because as far as I remember, this can interfere even with the owner window. So show in taskbar and set it to true. Let's now check it. So we press the register button, and now we see this window. Alright, let's now test if the program is registered. So when I start it again, I will input the real key and press register. Successful registration. And now we no longer see this button. Alright, that's it for this part. Thank you for watching. If you liked this tutorial, please share it with your friends, and see you next time.